Welcome to Through the Lens of Christ, a podcast designed to have conversation about things that are happening in culture, questions that we may have theologically, and other questions that impact our day in and day out lives. Our desire is to be able to build these conversations and to be able to get us to critically think not just about the events that are happening, but how do we see these events through the lens of Christ. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I hope it helps you to critically think through issues in our lives.
Well, hello, Vince, Ashley. How you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good.
This is we've got lots of firsts. So Vince and I have not done a podcast together, I don't believe. So this is exciting. And so we both had the privilege to speak at Easter. So we can share some of that. And then this is the Vince's live from his home gym, so he may do some reps while we're doing this. And I'm live from my work office, so I may get interrupted at some point, but we'll see. We'll see how all this goes. But so our intention and purpose in this is to go back through the text that we've studied together on Sunday, talk about just things that might stick out, maybe even things that we didn't get to. But there's certainly never enough time to be able to dive through everything. So we'll have Vince will read for us, and then we'll start talking. So take it away, Vince.
All right, sounds good. So again, we're starting in verse 54 of Acts 7. It says, "When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. 'Look,' he said, 'I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.' At this, they covered their ears, yelling at the top of their voices. They all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' Then he fell on his knees and cried out, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.' When he had said this, he fell asleep, and Saul approved of their killing him."
Yeah. So first, this was completely unintentional that the text lined up this way for Easter. So clearly, God was pointing us in that direction already, and so we're thankful that we were able to just stay in that act story and see Stephen and his sacrifice and how it mirrors Christ's sacrifice, and help us to more fully understand what we're being given. But so that was very interesting. So, but I would love to. Vince, you were able to listen to my message. I did not get a chance to listen to your message. I'm not sure if it's out there yet, but I didn't get a chance to listen to it. So I'm at a disadvantage. So I would love to know. One of my sons was there and said that it was amazing. So and I find this special just because we both wrestled through the text during the same week. We both really try to understand what it means, and I think we both have a very similar view, but yet it's coming through differently because we're different people. And so I think being able for us to talk through some of it is pretty interesting, just knowing that we both delivered messages on it. So I'd love to hear kind of what your just major themes were, and not just what you talked about, but I think we both approach the text in the same way, is trying to understand what is God speaking to us. What are we being convicted of, and how do we bring that message to people? So we'd just love to hear kind of what you were convicted in as you studied through this, and why it was important to bring it out.
No, I did. Yeah, I listened to your message, Adam, and it was very similar. We hit on a few of the same points, and obviously worded it a little bit differently, but overall the theme was pretty much the same. And it was this idea of the resurrected life, the hope that we can have in the resurrected life, and the encouragement that we should find because of that hope and because of the work that Jesus has done for us. But also the fact that we don't have to wait to experience the resurrected life until we're on the other side of eternity. Like, we can experience that resurrected life like right now. And it's mainly in the peace and the hope that we have that should translate to the love that we have for the lost world that don't know anything about this Jesus, or that don't, or the people who don't possess this hope. And I think Stephen does a great job of demonstrating that throughout this narrative, as did Jesus, obviously, when he was hanging on the cross. And so really is really centered around this idea of the peace that we have and how that really affects even the most challenging moments of our lives, as we saw with Stephen here. So that's kind of the direction I took. And Ashley, I think you listened to both messages. I think you might have a good sense too from a different perspective as to how we kind of approached both of these.
Yeah, you guys did touch on a lot of the same similar things. And I think the biggest thing that stood out to me in both messages was that concept of how do you love the lost? And I feel like there's two extremes of, loving them is telling them everything that they're doing wrong and telling them how they're failing. And then there's the other extreme of, well, we have to love everybody, so we have to accept everybody. And so I think that's a question I have for both of you is how do you actually love people well who aren't believers as a believer?
Yeah, I think that's that's the hard practical thing, right? Is that it is a broken world, and we're not told. I mean, we even see when we went through Stephen's discussion of history, how God clearly said, like, I'm holy. This is my standard. Don't do anything that diminishes that, right? So there is this tension. But yet, if we try to get kind of the cart before the horse, and if we're telling people you need to live this way in order to be accepted into the church, and in order to be accepted by Christ, in order to have salvation, we've missed it entirely. Because those behaviors are not things that we do to earn anything. Those behaviors are outcomes of what we've been given. And I think often, I know I'm guilty of this, is that you see things that are happening that that are against what the standard would be. And so I want to look at those things, and I want to say that can't happen. You've got to shut that down. You've got, and some of them are good things. I look at what we talked about from a pro-life conversation, right? It is good and right that we push for pro-life. It's good and right that we have that view. Yet if that is my only hope, then we've missed the point, right? And so, and if my standard is that you've got to live up to that and then you're good enough, then again, we're not loving the lost well. Because like Stephen was frustrated or I guess heartbroken for us that they just didn't see it. It was right in front of them. They didn't see it. So how do you take somebody that's blind and yell at them about what they can't see? That seems backwards.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the whole idea that Romans 5:8 was a verse I was convicted on throughout this week. It was while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. And it's like, we kind of made that point and hit on that pretty hard, where it's this idea of who are we to go and tell the world to figure it out first, and to go get their act cleaned up, and to go, get their worldview in order and in aligned with us. And then we start loving them. It's not how Christ did it. It's not the example that he set. And it's clearly not what Stephen did either. I mean, he was loving these people, even though they were throwing stones at his head. I mean, he continued to express his love and concern for them. And that's not like Stephen accepted their worldview or their beliefs or anything like that. It was he continued to love the lost person, not seeing them as this evil and malicious person, but this person who's lost and doesn't have the hope. And his heart was just breaking for them. And it's just this really, I think, expression of this Christ-like love and the hope that he has in the resurrection.
Yeah, and I think we need to be voices to people about, like, when we think about like LGBTQ issues, right? Like, how do we make sure people understand not just God's standard or what we're against, but why? And why does he have this view? Why does a right relationship between a man and a woman represent the gospel message? And why did he give that to us as an image of his love? And again, this isn't about like you need to change so that you can come into the church. This is just we want to help you see the world through new eyes, right? We want to help you to see, and I just can't give you new eyes, right? It's not my job. We've got to, if somebody is a believer, we should be teaching the right things so that they can see with new eyes and put all the pieces together. But if they're not yet a believer, we should be doing what Stephen and Christ himself did, which is, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I think we look at it often and go, they do know what they're doing. And so we need to make sure that they stop this, and they're horrible people. And I just don't see it that way. And I think it's really hard for us to not. And we do know that there's damage and destruction. I get frustrated with what is being taught to our next generation. I look at what's being normalized, and I look at the things that are are being accepted and told that you need to be part of these things and accept them and approve of them, our young people don't know any better, and they're going to be ingrained and indoctrinated into all of these things. So I do think we need to push back as believers and as a church. But again, that's different, right? Speaking truth in a world that doesn't hear it is different than condemning people and not desiring that they would be forgiven. So I think we do need both things.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it's the idea too of how we bring those truths forward, because I agree with you 100%, and it's how do we do that? Because people oftentimes they'll forget the content of the conversation, but will make the lasting impact is how they felt in that moment. Did they feel loved and even heard, but then addressed accordingly or addressed appropriately in that matter, not where we're shutting down a conversation by saying I'm right, you're wrong, that's the end of it, but actually expressing the why behind it and why God views it in such a way, and why living a controversial or a lifestyle that is opposed to God is really it's condemning to God almost. It's not right for this world, and it leaves us with just more struggles and more issues than we originally would have had anyway. So
Yeah, and I think I didn't listen to your message. I think you brought this point out more than I did. But even that Saul is standing there, right? He's not just watching this event, he is leading this event, right? The fact that they're laying the coats at his feet is likely that he is the one who's leading this thing. When he says he's a young man, he's like between 25 and 40, right? It's not like he wasn't 12, right? This was somebody who was established and a leader, and somebody who's moving this thing forward. Like, and so we see him who is adamantly opposed, and yet later we see this conversion. So it's not about us. Like, we wouldn't condone Paul's activities or Saul's activities, right? We wouldn't condone what he was doing, and we should be hurt by the persecution and all of those things. But yet, if we just turn our back on Saul because he was part of the wrong things and he had the wrong view and he failed in enormous ways, he himself, Paul himself says, I'm the chief amongst them, right? That he failed in such enormous ways. If we just wrote him off and said, you know what, leave me alone, we're opposed to you, you're dead to us. How big have we failed? What have we missed? God's plans are far greater than ours. We just need to be willing to see people for who they are, which is that there are people who are saved, who are still struggling, who are still trying to understand the world, and there's people who are lost and have no idea and are blind, and there's people who are mature in faith who are far more progressed than we are. Like, there's all different people at all different stages, but our job is to still love and still try to understand how do we bring them into right relationship, have eyes that see.
Right. And I think that's the big difference, is the difference between correcting behavior and building relationship. Because that's the difference between the law and having Christ. There's that relational aspect, you both touched on it a bunch already, is so critical to it that if you don't have that relationship established, the behavior is irrelevant.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's something that and again, some of this is generational, right? Like, you go back into the 70s and even the 60s, and you have like some pretty big Billy Graham movements, and then you start, moving into kind of mega church movement, and it was almost this a preacher, a personality presents, and then that's given, and people respond, and so you've got that kind of historical view. But where we're at today is that relationships are vitally important. And the ability to get information is so easy. You don't need to wait for a Billy Graham revival to come to town, right? You can grab 1,000 different people and get 1,000 different insights just with a couple of clicks of a button. And so we then don't take those same inputs the way that we did 40, 50 years ago. Now it requires that I know somebody, that there's a level of trust, that I've seen their life. Somebody like a Stephen, who somebody saw that you went through that pain and you went through that hurt. You're physically being killed. I saw it with my own eyes. We had a relationship, and you still responded in love, is going to be far more meaningful than just having a preacher say something on a Sunday morning and expect that to cause some change, right? It is, I think it's the relationship, and that's going to be more important than, we still have to give good messages. We still have to preach the word and be faithful, but it's what the body does collectively and how do we go out into the world that I think is going to make all the difference right now.
Yeah, and people are watching all of your actions, right? I mean, again, we're the church, we're the denomination, we're the Christians that claim that the Holy Spirit, the very Spirit of God, is living within us. And so, are we going to live like the rest of the world, or is there going to be something radically different within us? And the radical difference is the love of Christ within those relationships, right? And I always thought that verse 1 in chapter 8 was such an interesting verse because, I mean, it says Saul approved of their killing him. Like, we kind of already knew that, I was wondering, why is that in there? And I can just imagine Paul sitting down with Luke as he's writing this narrative. And at the very end of Stephen's death, he's saying, yeah, and I approved of all of this, right? It had such a lasting impact on Paul that he even sat down and confessed to it again, admitted to it again, made it absolutely clear because he wanted people to see that God's grace was chasing him down, even when he was stoning the messenger, even when he was killing Stephen, even when he was responsible for it. God was still pursuing him, and God still died on the cross for him, even in that moment. And God was still trying to pursue his heart. And it was through that, relationship and that experience of watching Stephen die and cry out for forgiveness that I think really convicted Paul later on in his life when he was finally, knocked off his horse.
Right. Yeah, I think that is such a good point, and I think it's a point of hope, right? So many people are like, "Well, I've done too much," and I think that Luke is saying, "Hey, look at this Saul guy, right? I mean, he participated, he approved of, he went out and after this went out and found other believers that he could have executed and persecuted. Like, you've not done too much, you've not gone too far." And that's the love and compassion aspect. And how do we keep that central? And I agree that we, as believers, I think you talked about it, Vince, that we've got to be held to such a high standard because people are watching, and that standard isn't something we've invented. In fact, it's not even something that we're necessarily trying to check all the boxes of. Is that the Spirit in us? If that's true, and if He's transforming us and changing us, then it's more of that coming out of us. And that should be telling to all of these other people, not just that we're telling them, hey, you can't do these list of things anymore, right? You know what? I don't struggle with same-sex attraction, so you shouldn't either. I don't struggle with being an alcoholic, so you shouldn't either. Right? And we're judgmental on the things we don't struggle with. But the things we struggle with, we find we give people a lot of grace on, right? So how do we make sure that we're not just trying to get somebody to live like us to be a mirror so that we feel better about us, but that we're really trying to draw people into relationship with Christ? And then He'll resolve all of those things. A genuine faith has genuine outcome. And so I think us not being so trapped in the what I don't like and how I'm going to be angry at the world, and more of they don't know. And if I see somebody that doesn't know, how loveless am I if I never talk to them about it, if I never bring it up? And I think that's what we're seeing with Stephen and Christ.
Yeah, isn't that such a stark contrast in this passage? The anger, the hate, the divisiveness, the rejection of the Sanhedrin, which I would argue really represents the world, but then the peace and the love of Stephen that is supposed to represent the church. And so that is how we're supposed to look so different from the rest of the world. And we see it right here in this passage. I mean, the council was gnashing their teeth at Stephen. They were angry. They were, oh, you had rejected my worldview. Okay, we are going to come and ambush you and drag you out of the city and stone you. Whereas Stephen is just like, you guys are missing it all. You guys are lost. And I want to show you who this Jesus is. And still, throughout this entire story, he is just totally at peace.
Yeah, well, and it's a great point because, like, even though I don't remember which verse it is, but where it says that they, as Stephen gives them the image, the vision that he's seeing, they cover their ears and they yell and they charge him, and you're like, that's exactly what we're seeing happen in the world today, where we talk about tolerance, but it's tolerant to everything but the Christian worldview. And so when you start providing a Christian worldview, the world covers their ears, says, I don't want to hear it. And they start yelling you down so that you have to back off. And like, that's exactly the scene that's playing out. Our response is normally, I'm going to yell louder. I'm going to smack your hands off your ears. I'm going to get your attention. I'm going to shout you down back. I'm going to, right. And it's like, that isn't biblical. That's not what we see at all. And all that does is show everybody else. If you're a third party watching the mess, you're like, why do I want either of those things? Right. But yet, how do we step back and go, man, they don't know. And we are rejecting their view, which is, it's condemning and it's convicting and it's frustrating. Of course, they're going to respond that way. But if we respond more in anger rather than love, it's just the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think a big thing that we oftentimes miss is what we see Stephen doing is he's coming to address the falsehoods or the false worldviews of the Sanhedrin. He's doing it out of love. He's literally sacrificing for him in this moment. He sacrifices his last breath to plead for mercy, but he is actually in this moment praying for these people. And I just wonder, I mean, that's such a huge aspect to reaching lost people and to showing them who Jesus is by first taking that initial step in praying for them. And I wonder how often, we go into a conversation, not prayerfully, not centered on Christ to lead and guide this conversation, but just to cram our views or whatever, our worldview down their throat as fast as we can in this kind of angry and violent sense that we just kind of talked about, where, it really should start, behind a closed door in prayer for that person. And that's really the initial step that should be taken when reaching the lost people.
Yeah. Well, I think we're probably out of time. But I will say this, I think that's a great point to end on. And I think that the more that we can just prayerfully come, I agree with you. I think Stephen, he was filled with the Holy Spirit. His heart was for other people. He knew his salvation was secure. He knew theirs wasn't. And so he just had a heart for them. And so that starts in prayer. It starts in our own sanctification. It starts with our own understanding of who Christ is. And then how do we bring that out to a world that obviously desperately needs it? Well, thank you both.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.